Hi, I'm Dr. Jessica McLeese, licensed clinical psychologist and certified sex therapist. I had a reader recently ask me a question about a sexual desire gap in marriage, and I'm answering it here in this video. So here's the question I received. I entered marriage without knowing I lacked sexual desire. Before we married, my husband described to me his longing for a passionate sexual bond between us, but my lack of understanding my asexuality made me deaf to his words. My church upbringing taught me there was virtue in my lack of temptation for sex, and he sought outside help from the church leadership, but to no avail. I also did not relate to the descriptions of normal sexual response presented to me in books and conversations between us before and after marriage. My asexuality led to decades of severe distress and depression for my faithful husband. At this point, I believe one of the greatest gifts that Christian counselors and therapists can give to clients are to, one, encourage them to know their sexual selves before making a commitment to be married, and two, to celebrate the sexual bond that is meant to be the core of marriage. This bond can only happen if their sexual needs are relatively equal. So I want to address a couple of things here. First of all, the church is often taught that it's good to avoid temptation prior to marriage. And in extreme cases, people have taken this to mean that a lack of desire is good or holy or righteous. So we've confused the ability to discipline our desires with the necessity of not feeling them. So instead of learning how not to act on sexual urges, we learn that not having them at all is better. Now, as a therapist, this has been a difficult place for me to reconcile with people. I've actually worked with ladies scared to death of marriage, feeling like once they got married, they'd have to have sex multiple times a day, and with really believing that their husbands would always think about sex. And when I say always, I mean always, like every second of every single day, no other thoughts available to their husbands. Now, that would be unhealthy if their husbands were really thinking that way, and as a new wife, it'd be pretty intimidating. And I've also known of Christians to pray and beg God to take away sexual urges until they get married. Now, this really speaks to the fear we have in regards to our sexuality. It's okay to feel a little horny sometimes. You just have to discipline those urges. And by the way, that's a life lesson because marriage doesn't mean you won't have urges that you can't righteously fulfill. You always have to practice self discipline. Now, I fully believe that the church, and I mean the general church, the body of believers, not just a pastor, has to get to the place where we teach that sex is good. But in this good thing called sex, there are boundaries to put in place. So, not the message of do whatever it takes to avoid sex before marriage, but instead discipline your bodies and practice self control. And then have fun in marriage. Now, here's my second thought. There's a lot of confusion regarding sexual response. Usually, men are more likely to pursue sex, and women are more likely to be receivers. Also, men typically experience desire and arousal at the same time with little separation between the two events, where women typically feel desire after they feel arousal. It's kind of like I don't necessarily think of chocolate cake after every meal, but if it's sitting in front of me, I'm going to notice. So someone who's asexual may find that desire and arousal has not existed, and this can happen with bad teaching about the sexual response cycle and can eventually become pretty ingrained messages for them. So instead of enjoying foreplay and really choosing to learn what feels good, they might rush through sex and try to make their spouse orgasm quickly so they can get this whole thing over with. And that can actually create a belief that's hard to extinguish because the asexual spouse has learned that sex doesn't feel good. And when you believe that to be true, it can be really difficult to get out of that mindset and start enjoying the sexual relationship. Now, I want to speak to the suggestions that were made by the reader. The church should encourage people to know their sexual selves, and sex drive should be fairly equal in marriage. Now, I agree that you should have an understanding of what sex means to you and your partner prior to getting married. You can do this by asking a few questions. What does sex mean to you? What does the Bible say about sex? Why did God create sex? Now, those are just starter questions, but it can give you some understanding regarding where you both are in light of your sexual relationship. And now to the second part of that statement, that sex drives need to be fairly matched for the relationship to work. Now, certainly, two people who are asexual and two people who heavily enjoy sex are more likely to enjoy their sexual relationship without a lot of complication than a couple where one wants sex weekly and the other would prefer yearly. Even so, couples often don't really know what their sexual lives will look like prior to marriage, especially if they were virgins before getting married. Now, you may have an idea of what it'll look like, but it's completely normal for drives to change over time. For instance, couples usually experience a higher drive early in their marriage, higher when they're trying to have kids, and then higher again when the kids finally leave the home. And then maybe surges and dips for either spouse throughout marriage. Now, if there is a significant difference between you and your spouse, please know that you're not alone in this. You may just find that seeking out a sex therapist can be really helpful. But no matter what, I encourage you to open the lines of communication with your spouse. Talk about what it means to connect in your relationship, both sexually and non sexually. Make sure that you're connecting in a variety of ways. And sometimes, for a spouse that feels no sexual urge, use sex as a way to let your spouse connect to you. Be enthusiastic and keep in mind that your gift of your body shows your spouse that you love them. And request that your spouse be just as enthusiastic about connecting with you in non sexual ways, like date nights or cuddling on the couch. Don't settle for a mediocre marriage. Talk about how to have your most fulfilling marriage and sex life and take the steps that you need to take to make it happen. Blessings on you, your marriage, and may you always be fully well.